not earmuffs, and they are not, headphones. And it's also not the top of a Dracula cape, just in case you were wondering that, which is what my grandnephew thinks they are. So I'm absolutely delighted to be with you, honored to be invited to be part of this, and look forward to our time together today. I want to thank you for making the time to be part of this experience. And I think we're all reeling, if you will, from the times in which we find ourselves. COVID-19, of course, which is why we're gathering virtually. And certainly the most recent pandemic within a pandemic, if you will, with all the racial unrest and uprising, to say nothing of our political atmosphere in which we're living now. You know, as I prayed to be with you today, I was taken that today's feast seems absolutely appropriate for the AUSCP Assembly this year, our Catholic faith in a political world, because as many of you know, our church lifts up St. John Fisher and St. Thomas More, who certainly lived their faith in a political world, and they live the gospel in the public square. And so we seem to be in very, very, very good company. I have a gentleman here who's going to move the slide. So Brogan, if you want to move to the next slide, please. So as always, my brothers and sisters, whenever we approach really anything that we do, and certainly approach an opportunity to be with each other in this deep space of retreat and reflection today, we first have to step back. And so I just have a couple of pictures here to just kind of create that space of stepping back. Okay, Brogan, you can keep going. A black hole, which we noticed just a little while ago, discovered, if you will, something that was totally mysterious and now visible to us. What we know, you can keep going, Brogan. What we know about black holes like this one is it has the capacity to capture light. Pure mystery, capturing pure mystery. A good piece of context for us. And you see what happens, at least the pictures that we have, of how this mystery actually captures us. And stay here for a minute, Brogan. This is one of my favorite pictures, because while we step back into the larger context of the cosmos, we also are where we are. I love this. Some of the scientists refer to this as detail. So that little dot with the arrow, that's detail. Next slide, please, Brogan. But it's not the detail of where you are sitting right now. It's the detail of our home planet, planet Earth. It is a detail within the larger cosmological perspective and the heart of God. Next slide. And so what we know about our little detail, our planet, is there's great cause for joy. The celebration of the gifts of water and air and land, as Jackie said, that we celebrated a couple years ago when I was with you, that Francis has laid out for us in Laudato Si. Also, great cause for joy is that the planet herself is sustainable. And I don't know about you, but I've noticed that where I am in the East Coast here in Maryland, the air and the plants, and I'm hearing birds that I never heard before. It's as if we humans who are not able to breathe and live in the same way we're used to, running all over the place, while that's happening to us and we're staying inside, the planet seems to be just celebrating her ability to sustain herself if we do not interfere. We also know, of course, though, that in our created world, our detail on our planet, incredible cause for heartbreak, mostly due to lack of respect of everything that lives and lack of reverence for everything that lives. The same way within the human community. We're one species among many. I heard Thomas Berry say years ago that if the human species disappeared tomorrow from the planet, every other species would benefit 7 times. And I'm wondering, as I watch what happens to the natural world these days, how the smog disappears from Los Angeles, how you can see snow on the top of the Himalayas, which people haven't seen in 37 years. But we also know within the human community, great cause for joy, great cause. The compassion that's being poured out by so many people in this time of crisis, and the accompaniment that people offer to each other freely out of great generosity, great cause for joy among our human community. And there's also great cause for heartbreak. And again, the heartbreak comes primarily because of a lack of respect for all human life and the lack of reverence to actually revere the image of God presented to us in all our brothers and sisters. So who would have ever thought that on this planet, a little virus, a coronavirus, that seems to have some beauty to it actually under the microscope, could literally cause us to stop, just stop still. But it has done that all over the planet, and it's continuing to do it here in our homeland. A couple of months ago, actually, I was in a Zoom conversation and someone said that their experience of the pandemic at that time of COVID-19 reminded them of two images, two metaphors. One was an earthquake that actually came from nowhere, if you will, and totally flattened the structures, or at least wobbled them, all the structures that we know, from politics to healthcare to education to religion, all of the structures just wobbled like crazy in this earthquake that went across the planet. And the second image that they offered was, like in many Asian countries, an earthquake followed by a tsunami. And look at the perspective there of a tsunami caused by an earthquake. It dwarfs everything that is left standing. Look at this picture. Very little control anyone would have over that kind of force and power. And so I think the images of earthquake and tsunami are helpful as we enter into this retreat, as we consider what is shaken within us, what is being swept away, literally swept away, by way of consciousness, by way of attitude, even structures that we might be, even meetings. You know, this assembly was supposed to be in Baltimore at the Maritime Museum, totally swept away. And thankfully, we have another way to gather. So this coronavirus, this global earthquake and tsunami has done a number on our sense of time, literally, which is why this crazy clock, I think, is so helpful. Because what it's done is, for the past months and weeks and days and hours and seconds, our lives have actually stopped time. I don't know about you, but I wonder sometimes what day it is, you know, or what week. I'm now into week 15, I think, of working from home. And so the second piece of detail, besides the planet, is our own country. And we could probably stop on this slide for the rest of our time together and just spend some time in reflection on what is our call to live the gospel in this public square at this moment in time. What does it mean to be Catholic in a political world? And of course, the next slide provides two images that have just literally stopped the world as well as our own country. I don't know about you, but the images that capture me here seem to be not an invitation, but right in front of my face is a horizontal lynching done by someone who looks like they are sort of genuflecting. The obscenity of those images has turned the world, and certainly our country, upside down. Next slide, please, Brogan. And of course, the murder of Mr. George Floyd, again, has gone all over the world, has unleashed in our home, in our detail, in the planet, in our little homeland of the United States here, has unleashed something that most of us haven't seen in the last 50 or 60 years. It too has stopped time. We can hardly get out of our heads 526 seconds or 8 minutes and 46 seconds of what happened to Mr. George Floyd, what happened to one human being by another human being. It has stopped time for us. And of course, another piece of context for us is this image. And we could probably stop here again, as we could on the coronavirus, as we could on the murder of George Floyd, as we could on this picture. The institutional structure of our church, whom we love, has been for many, many, many years, certainly since Vatican II, has been trying to find its equilibrium again after its time was also stopped. And so I want to thank my brothers who make up the Association of U.S. Catholic Priests for the incredible contribution that your coming together makes to the church in this country and to the world, because you have taken very seriously the vision of the gospel and the vision of the Vatican II Church. Look at those words in relationship to what is needed in our country right now, what's needed in our church whom we love right now, and what's needed in our world right now. Mutual support, collegial voice, dialogue, contemplation, prophetic action, compassion, hope, and joy for a pilgrim church and a world. So thank you for the commitment that you bring to the living of the Paschal Mystery, to the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Your witness and your invitation to all of us to be brought into that is deeply, deeply appreciated. And so what I'd like to do today is spend, now that we're in that context, and I think you can get a sense of the scope of the context. It is global, it is national, and it is right where each of us is sitting, and is all those things together. If you take nothing from this reflection today, I invite you to hold on to that thread. That when we try to act politically, we are acting where our feet are. We are acting in the larger state or nation where we are acting in the local and larger church, and we're acting in the world. There's no such thing as political action that is just, in this case, in Washington, D.C., or just at our local state house, or at a soup kitchen. That's one of the unlearnings that we have to do, that political action begins where your feet are and continues outward. So what I'd like to invite us to, the first part of our time together is, as some of you, if you have the little handout that I offered you, to take a look at living the gospel through baptismal call and then our vocational call. And we'll do that with me for a little while now, and then you'll have time to be in your small groups for some reflection and conversation, and we'll come back to the large group for some sharing and question and answer. Then we'll take a break. The second part of our time together will be living in the public square. So I've deliberately separated living the gospel and living in the public square. So I'd like to just kind of to say, when we talk about mission discipleship, we're really talking about, as you know, the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. For those of us from our faith tradition, that is the focus of our life and our mission. It is the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. And our church reminds us that Jesus, as priest, prophet, and king, that we're baptized into that same priesthood, prophet, and king. But I find it interesting to notice that what's understood in the commentaries about priest, prophet, and king are the next words: sacrifice, word, and focus. That our invitation into the priesthood of Christ is to be invited into the sacrifice. That our invitation in baptism to be invited into the prophetic word of Christ is to, in fact, speak with our lives and sometimes with actual words. And that the focus that we're invited into in terms of the kingship of Christ is the same focus that he was invited into. That his life was not about him. His life always pointed to the kingdom and to the Father. So ours needs to be. And then the last 2 points there. we're invited into the common priesthood by our baptism, which is a different priesthood than our brothers who are ordained, who are invited into a ministerial priesthood. So what I'm going to be talking about today is the baptismal call for all of us into the priesthood and the prophet and king role of Jesus Christ. We are all invited into that. Our ministerial brothers are invited into priesthood that in a particular way demonstrates that sacrifice, word, and focus. So when we talk about a vocational call, we're actually talking about discernment. You know, I don't know about you, but in many religious congregations of women, a lot of their vocation and formation work, vocation especially, has moved to discernment, which, again, I don't know about you, but I'm 52 years in religious life. And back in the day, religious congregations, if they did anything about vocation work, it was sort of more like recruitment. The idea was if you had a vocation, it was that you were then called to that congregation. Many congregations are realizing no, especially in these current times, to help people discern what their calling in life is, whether they enter the priesthood, enter religious life or not, that the work of vocations is much broader than we originally, at least in my time, understood. Why is that so important? Well, because the work of discernment kind of goes countercultural right now. I don't know about you, but it's a little challenging to learn how to listen and speak to each other. If you look at the news, there's very little listening and speaking going on at all, it seems. So to really listen and speak to each other, much less to listen and be able to speak to the God of our hearts, to be able to decide and discern, where is God calling me? The solitude and the solidarity, and again, in our culture, to try to find places of solitude that are not imposed, like the stay-at-home orders, to try to find a way to be in solidarity with others, not just others who are like you, but in real solidarity. The elements of stillness and silence, so critical in the discernment process. And again, in this culture, not really sure that silence and stillness are virtues and practices that are kind of taught, if you will. And then, of course, discernment always holds up the common good, not the Carol good, but the common good, and always in light of the signs of the times. So when we talk about living the gospel, we're talking about a vocation, and a vocation must be grounded in discernment. Discipleship. Discipleship, as we know, has to do with a sense of integrity, of living out our baptismal call, a sense of fidelity, a witness by our life, and maybe even by our words sometimes, but mostly by our life. Discipleship is done in community, and it is always focused on the common good. So again, just some characteristics that I know we know, but if we're going to try to reflect on living the gospel in the political world, we have to make sure that not only are we missionary, but we are disciples. So what does our integrity of our gospel life look like? What about the fidelity of it? How do we witness it? How is it lived in community? And how am I a person focused first on the common good and then on the Carol good? So gospel life, like all other aspects of life, as we know, go through times of change, go through a time of transformation. There are more times of change than there are time of transformation. I'm going to say a little bit more about that later on. But those two words, change and transformation, are really, really critical. And what I want to say for now is that if you don't like change, well, I suggest you find a nice, comfortable place to just kind of hermit yourself in, because you cannot stop change. You just cannot. If you don't believe that, just take a look in the mirror and then take some pictures of, a year or so ago. Change is coming whether we like it or not. It is the nature of things that live to change. And so the invitation in gospel life is to embrace change, rather than reset. You can't stop it. You absolutely cannot stop it. So the gospel invitation is to embrace change. Transformation is another whole story. Is all transformation change? Absolutely. Is all change transformation? Absolutely not. And the difference is that we have to choose transformation. We can, in fact, stop transformation. I offer this as a little piece for this first part of our reflection because in light of the context that we just looked at, I think obviously change is coming, whether it's change in the church, change in the country, change in terms of understanding climate change, or change in terms of racism. I mean, you can feel the change that's just pushing forward. Whether we choose to embrace it or not is another question for us. And if we choose the transformation that comes because of the change, then we're on a different kind of journey. So I just want you to hold out that little piece about the difference between change and transformation. And from all points of view, it seems that not only is our planet and our country and our church structures and political structures and every other structure you can think of, not only are we in for a huge, huge moment of change, we are on an evolutionary transformational trajectory right now. I'm going to say more about that later on, about the difference between the two. So evolutionary times are happening at the universe level, like the discovery of black holes. Not that they weren't there before, but we discovered them. So the universe is evolving, but so are we as a species in order to be in a different kind of relationship at the cosmological level. The planet is certainly evolving. Institutions are evolving. Cultures are evolving. And as Pope Francis reminds us all the time, especially in Laudato Si', when we live in evolutionary times, we have got to understand that new wine needs new wineskins. You cannot do the old thing in a new way, and you cannot do a new thing in an old way. New wine demands new wineskins. I offer this slide to simply remind us that it is not just the planet that is in an evolutionary moment. It's not just religious or political structures and institutions that are having an evolutionary moment. It is not just the universe that's, birthing new stars and planets. It's not just that cultures are evolving, the ways that groups of people learn how to be together. All of it is at an evolutionary time. The reason why I want to point this out is if you feel overwhelmed at some points in your life, welcome to the Overwhelmed Club. What the history of evolution tells us is that these evolutionary shifts come along about every 300 to 400 years. So I don't know that there's too many people around now who went through the last huge evolutionary shift. It is a very unsettling time, very unsettling. And all of these line up even more rarely than each of their own evolutionary times. So we're in a tremendous moment. Why do I say that? Because it is going to upend, it seems to me, how we understand what it means to live a gospel life. It's going to upend that. Why do I say that? Well, because part of what is being upended, if you will, the gospel life included, is to understand the gospel from a deinstitutionalized perspective. And what do I mean by that? Well, let me use religious life as an example. It's the one I know best. Religious life, especially apostolic religious life, was never intended to be an institution. Our particular founder, Father Medaya, a Jesuit, back in 1650 in Le Puy, France, gathered a couple of women together to help them deepen their spirituality, to have a sense of the common good, we would say, or a sense of community, and to be of service to the dear neighbor. That's Sister St. Joseph language, the dear neighbor. And his instruction to them, if you will, or his invitation was for them to divide the city and take care of the needs. It was at best a template for a social movement. Religious life is intended to be a social movement. It's intended to be a radical response to the gospel in a particular history, culture, and moment in time. It became institutionalized. And please notice my tone of voice. I'm not judging that. It's not good, bad, right, or wrong. It became institutionalized. And we are now in a moment, as many of you know, of being de-institutionalized. I use that as an example, but I would apply it to the church, certainly to the gospel. The gospel at its heart is a social movement, if you will, built on community, built on relationships, mutuality of relationships, and built on being of service to something beyond yourself, and to try to create a world where your feet are that is more aligned with what is in the heart of God in terms of everybody and every living being being held in communion. The gospel was never intended to be institutionalized. So some of what we're struggling with when we try to live the gospel life in the public square, or we try to live our Catholic faith in the political world, we're struggling with this evolutionary moment where we are actually living at a time where the gospel itself and the church is being de-institutionalized. It's very unsettling, very unsettling. So that it moves more towards a social movement, because the key elements of a gospel life are the next four: prayer, spirituality, community, and witness. Now, can you do that in an institution? Absolutely, you can. Can you do it in a social movement? Absolutely, you can. That's why I'm saying you have to be really careful here and apply critical theory. You have to suspend judgment. I'm not saying the institution is better than social movement or vice versa. I'm saying in an evolutionary time, everything that has been, which for many of us in our Catholic faith, our faith has been institutionalized. There is a shift going on to de-institutionalize, not because it's bad, but to de-institutionalize because something else is emerging that is needed. So the gospel life, this combination of a baptismal call and a vocational call, is a life that is lived in community. And I raise that because if in fact we're looking at our Catholic faith in the political world and we're trying to live the gospel in the public square, it is by very definition, it is a life that is lived in community. And again, I don't know about you, but I see such a hunger for a community these days. And maybe it's the social distancing that we're doing. Maybe it's trying to come out of the stay-at-home, shelter-in-place kind of mandates that we had for the past several months. But I would say even underneath of that, I walk around the neighborhood here, and even with behind masks and making sure you're far apart from somebody, there's a hunger to like kind of say hello to people. And now, of course, we're just nodding and speaking with our eyes. But the very fact that we are human means we are made for relationship. And so community life is absolutely critical. And so one of the pieces that will be necessary to live a gospel life and live it in the public square, in a political world, is doing it together. You don't do it together because there's more of us than there is of them. That's not the notion. You do it together because that's what the gospel demands. Certainly a prayer life, and I mean a prayer life that actually transforms us at our core. A life of service, always a sense of mission. This is not about getting something to happen on November 3rd that you want to happen. It's not about that. I mean, it is partly, perhaps, but it's about a sense of mission. What is it that the gospel demands us to do in this election cycle, for example? What does the gospel demand us to do in this incredible social and racial unrest and uprising? That sense of mission, it's the gospel that dictates the direction. And then all the emergent expressions, it kind of goes back to the earthquake and the tsunami. If we think for 1 minute that after this is all over, whenever that is, that there will be a new normal, Even that language that we throw around a little bit. I heard somebody say a little while ago, I'm not really sure that new normal is a goal because I'm not at all sure that what happened before COVID-19 was normal. That has really stayed with me. I'm not really sure that my community life pre-COVID-19 was really normal. I'm not sure my prayer life was normal. I'm not sure my life of service. I'm not even sure my sense of mission. So this time calls for an incredible deep dive in our own discernment about what is the quality of the gospel life that we're called to live. What will that look like in church life for my ordained brothers in this retreat right now? I am sure that's a question you're holding. And I'm sure it's deeper than what I hear sometimes, will they come back to church, Or have people found a variety of ways to have a deepening of their community life, their prayer life, even a life of service, a sense of mission. So to not be prepared for emergent expressions of the gospel life, I think would be quite foolish on our part. Because after earthquakes and tsunamis, there will always be what never was before the earthquake or the tsunami. So all of this is to lift up this piece that we know about discernment. And discernment, as we know from the life of Jesus, is constitutive to a gospel life. One of the interesting things about discernment is you don't decide in discernment, you discern. So those of us that are like trying to make really good decisions, and I'm not saying don't continue to do that, but discernment and decision are not the same. And I like this insight about discernment. It's the ability to see things for what they really are and not for what you want them to be. So is our own living of the gospel life, is our own baptismal call to mission and discipleship, is our own vocational call to discernment and discipleship. Are we able to see it for what it really is and not for what we want it to be? And are we really able to see it for how God really needs it to be and not for what we want it to be? And I say that quite simply because what we know about a gospel life lived fully and well, much like discernment, is it demands an incredible amount of inner freedom. The Jesuit sense of discernment is that that you have discerned, or you're in the process of discernment and moving towards what he calls a holy abandon, a place where if you're deciding between A and B, discerning between A and B, you get to a place where you're able to say, if the call is to A, the answer is yes. If the call is to B, the answer is yes. And both yeses are 100%. Now, again, I don't know about you, but that depth of inner freedom is really hard to come by. How do you get to that kind of inner freedom? Spiritual journey says you can only get there out of a stance of contemplation, a contemplative stance, a stance where you are listening to God and to others, and you listen simply to understand what someone else is saying. And again, I don't know about you, but listening seems to be an art that's quite lost in our culture, and even in our parish communities, in our families, and among our friends. And to give you a little test in terms of, you're probably listening now. I don't know, you might be checking some emails or looking at your phone, but you're probably listening. But a good test for contemplative listening is, in the back of your head, you hear a little tape saying, oh, I wonder when we're going to go to the small groups because I'd like to go get a cup of coffee. Or if we were actually at a venue, at a meeting place like we were supposed to be at the Maritime Museum in Baltimore, you'd be looking at your watch saying, I wonder how much longer she's going to speak because I really want to stand up and stretch. That's a good test to say that you are really not listening And the reason for that is listening is really, really, really hard. It's hard to do. It takes a lot of energy. But without listening from a contemplative stance, there will be no inner freedom and there'll be no ability to discern. Excuse me. And it's not only discernment for myself, it's communal discernment, which is where that common good comes in. And you know, I've spoken, as you probably have too, so many times about the common good. And you know, people are all for the common good. Yes, we should do that. Yes, we should stop drinking bottled water. Yes, we should travel less, you know, for the environment and so forth. But it usually translates into, yes, we should do that, and you should be the one that starts doing it. I often say for communal discernment and the common good, that the finger usually points to somebody else. It rarely comes back to me. Communal discernment does not allow us to behave that way. So communal discernment demands that we in fact do this together, and there's no finger pointing, you know, that you should do this, you should do that, you know, be a better world, or the gospel life will be lived more fully if you would just get out there and, you know, join an action group or something. The pointing comes this way, which again demands deep listening, and it demands a mutuality of purpose when we're trying to do this together. We cannot be at odds with each other. You cannot try to bring, you know, our Catholic faith in the political world and try to live the gospel in a public square if we are not coming from the same common place, which I'm proposing is the gospel, and then the commonplace grows out from there. The reason I say that is, at least in my own justice work, there's a lot of what we tend to call the laundry list of justice issues. You know, I'm all for, taking care of the environment, or, you know, I want to put my efforts towards economic equality, or, you know, racial justice, or, you know, democratic, whatever it might be. What usually ends up happening, unless there's a change of consciousness going on, is we end up competing with each other for who's going to get the most energy around climate change, or, you know, will immigration and, you know, racism, and will that all rise to the top because that's my issue, you know. That's self-defeating. Is absolutely self-defeating. The insight these days is to know that the mutuality of purpose is around living a gospel life and trying to help the world by our witness be a place that more closely aligns with the vision that Jesus had and the communities that he tried to create. If we are mutually together around that, then how that energy spills out in all the diversity is a gift. But my experience is that we're not usually really together on a mutuality of purpose. So how do we do this? How do we actually lead as we move into the future out of this gospel life perspective? Well, first thing I would offer is we absolutely have to resist denial. And you've heard it said before, denial is not just, you know, a river somewhere. There's an incredible, incredible cycle of deception, disintegration, and denial. We see it happening everywhere. And one of the insights from Thich Nhat Hanh, years and years ago, somebody asked him who started the first Iraqi war. And he sat for about 3 minutes, which in an interview is a very long time. And he finally simply said 2 words, I am. Then he went on to teach for about a half hour to basically say, whatever is happening on the stage of the outer world is a reflection of what is happening in our own inner worlds. And whatever is happening in our inner worlds is reflected on the outer world. I say that because the denial about all kinds of things, from climate change to the virus, to racism, white supremacy, you just continue naming whatever list you have in your mind and heart. One of the things that that list has in common is the level of denial the scope is huge, and the depth of it seems to be only growing deeper. So in order for us to live this gospel life, we will have to resist the denial, which will then free us to embrace the reality. I don't know about you, but I have, for the first time in my life, done a deeper dive into my own sense of entitlement that comes to me in this culture simply because I'm a person of no color. Parenthetically, by the way, there really are no white people. White is the background of this PowerPoint you're looking at. If you ever saw anybody coming at you that color, you'd probably run in the opposite direction. There are people of color and people of no color. I have done a much deeper reflection on my own benefit that I have gained from the system, if you will, in this country that is racist at its root. Embracing that reality is, I'm far from really doing it, but just scratching the surface a little bit. It is very, very uncomfortable. The other piece about leading into the future is to be able to let go often. And it doesn't mean whatever. It means to hold lightly, to let go often and freely, to be way more open in my own thinking, as well as in relationship and conversation with others, to name the fears. I just named one for you. It is very, very scary for me to keep doing my own reflection and discernment, much less joining others who are willing to do this also, about the consequence of racism in this country, how it's institutionalized, and how I have benefited. Every bit of my life has benefited from that institution. It's very, very, very unsettling and very scary. But it's the only way where I'm going to be able to engage life fully. And so just a couple more things here. Where this living of the gospel seems to be moving in order to be viable. And when I say that, I mean whether you are in a family community, a circle of friends, a religious community, a parish community, a town, a city, a state, a country, the planet. The viability is in small, meaning few, really, really, really healthy and meaningful relationships and communities that are able to be flexible, not so staid. I don't mean, not having rules and regulations and law and order, that we're not throwing that out. Flexible, you've got to have a lot of strength to be flexible, to be nimble, to be able to respond to needs that come up that are in the political world and the public square, which demands a lot of freedom. The viability is local. I will tell you right now that all religion and all politics are local. They're local. And then they are regional, and then they are national, and then they are global. The viability of the gospel life is going to need to be way more adaptive. And adapt doesn't mean everything and anything goes. Adaptive means you're able to look at the reality in front of you, and as Francis says so often, respond in a pastoral way to people's needs. Adaptive and obviously creative. So as we come to the end of this first part of our time together this afternoon, we'd like to close in a minute with a video reflection of a hymn, Do Not Fear to Hope by Rory Cooney. And it's very interesting to me that this was written in 1983. And the video reflection that we're going to see in a moment was created in the year 2000. And I say that because I think it still calls to mind this question for me in this day and age in 2020. In what ways is my life a witness to the life, the ministry, the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ? Where am I challenged to a deeper living of the gospel message? And I offer these questions for your reflection because, as you'll hear and experience in this video reflection of the hymn, Do Not Fear to Hope, that if we can have conversation about these questions, we will be able in any time period and on any issue that violates the message of the gospel, we will be able to live in hope. And it's the hope that will make our Catholic faith be viable in the political world. And it's our hope that makes living the gospel in the public square such a witness. So I invite you to, I'm going to say enjoy, but to prayerfully let this song just kind of seep in along with these two questions. So we'll listen to the hymn, Do Not Fear to Hope now, please.
Do not fear to hope, though the wicked rage and rise. Our God sees not as we see, success is not the prize. Do not fear to hope, for though the night be long, the race shall not be to the swift, the fight not to the strong. Look to God when victory seems out of justice sight. Look to God, whose mighty hand brought forth the day from the chaos of the night. Do not fear to hope, though the wicked rage and rise. Our God sees not as we see, success is not the prize. Do not fear to hope, for though the night be long, the race shall not be to the swift, the fight not to the strong. Look to God when reason fails and terror reigns in the night. Look upon the crucified
So I would like to invite you now to some time with each other in smaller groups. And I hope that you have, if you don't have the copies of the little handout that I sent with you, you can access them on your computer. They were sent out from the AUSCP office. But the questions are, in what ways is my life a witness to the life, the ministry, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ? And where am I challenged, especially in these times? Where am I challenged to a deeper living of the gospel message? So I'm going to turn this back over to the technicians. You'll have about a half hour or so in your small group. And when we come back, we'll have an opportunity to interact with the questions. I don't know about questions, but feedback, and if there's any responses that I might be able to offer. So I'll turn this over now to the technicians.
Okay, I have a question.
Yes.
Define the contemplative stance for us and how to be part of the evolution in the church and as a church.
Well, those could probably take the rest of today and the rest of your meeting. Great questions. Thank you.
It's from Tulio. Good question. So.
Yes, excellent. Yeah. I would say, first of all, a stance is how you kind of position yourself to face the world. And so let me do something that's not contemplative. Okay. It seems that many of us, at least in the Western world, have positioned ourselves in the world, and the global North also. We positioned ourselves in a competitive way. We've positioned ourselves to be right. We've positioned ourselves to be in charge. We've positioned ourselves to have the first and last word. You know, I think you get the feel for that, you know. So a stance is how you kind of position yourself to face your world, whether it's the world in the mirror or the world, you know, once you leave your room in the morning and your house and so forth. A contemplative stance, to position oneself in the world from a contemplative heart, is to have as your modus operandi that you are going to listen more than speak. There's no talking in contemplative work. You do not talk. A big difference between talking and speaking. We position ourselves in the world, many of us, to talk a lot. That is not the same as speaking. So one characteristic of a contemplative stance is to position yourself as a listener, as a speaker, someone who speaks, but only speaks to be understood, not to convince somebody of whatever your agenda is or whatever your thought is. You know, my time with you today, in my own prayer, I have prayed that it come from a contemplative place. I am speaking to you out of my own heart and reflect. I'm not speaking to convince you of anything or to prove a point, you know. So I think that's one thing about how we position ourselves in the world, speaking and listening. The other thing I would say is that a contemplative stance has to do with trying to really live in such a way that is authentic and genuine. And again, I think if you just look at the larger culture that we live in, not those of us on this Zoom retreat, of course, you know, but other people, and maybe we know some who live in the world, in such a way that that it, you know, it's almost like who matters first and most is I, you know. And so a contemplative stance is a place that says I matter, of course, you know, but I matter because you matter. There's a lot of African cultural elements that are very contemplative in their very nature. One of the proverbs says, if you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, you go together. That's a way of positioning yourself in the world. It's by nature communal as opposed to individualistic. I think some of you have probably seen the observation from some European countries about why the US COVID-19 numbers are what they are. And a lot of the European countries have very different profiles of cases and deaths. And one of the observations from a lot of the European folks is that the individualistic culture in the US is working against us right now. If you don't want to wear a mask, then you don't wear a mask. If you want to think it's fine to go out and get your hair cut and go to a movie, then you go. Nobody's going to tell you, what you can or cannot do. And again, that's not good or bad, right or wrong. It is a position that we take as we kind of face the world and relate to it every day or face each other. A contemplative stance would be that what I do affects you and what you do affects me. And that drives my decision, whether I'm going to wear a mask or not. So it's just a little example. The second piece, second question, in terms of the evolution, in terms of church, I don't know if you're meaning church as people of God or church as institution. I'm going to presume that it's church as institution, because the church as the people of God is already gathered in this wonderful time together. You are evolving. That's why you came together, because you feel that evolutionary impulse, if you will, of the Spirit from the work of the Spirit from Vatican II. And so many of you, especially our ordained brothers, have been very attentive to that movement of the Spirit. So I'm going to imagine that you're talking about the evolution in the institutional church. The change theorists have been saying for about 20 years now that Western civilization, the institutions of Western civilization are headed for collapse. And not because they're bad, but because their time has come, they've made their contribution, and it's time for something else. And that the last 50 years of the collapse will be very painful, because when something is about to collapse, it does everything it can to hold on to itself. And so I think in terms of institutions, all of them, including religion, including church, I think we are looking at a time of collapse impacted by lots of different circumstances. So I think the evolutionary piece would say to just be attentive to what is going on. And if the conversation is about fixing something and standing it back up again, so it was what it was before Vatican II or before COVID-19 or before whatever line of demarcation you want to point to, there's a big difference in evolutionary theory. You don't fix something in evolutionary theory. You embrace it as it continues to evolve. And so I would say in terms of the evolution of our institutional church, I think to embrace the movement of the evolution is one way to relate to it. To try to fix it or reform it is another whole conversation. And you do not fix or reform evolutionary entities. It's an oxymoron. You cannot fix or reform an evolutionary process.
We have two comments, a comment and a question. One is that the comment, your experience with white privilege is what impressed us. And then kind of a question, especially we priests who are male, white, and the big guy in the parish, privilege. Can you address that notion of white privilege, and try to go forward from there?
Oh, these are wonderful questions. Really, thank you. Yeah, let me start with the question about my ordained brothers on this in this retreat right now, but certainly larger than that. male, white, and the privileged place, if you will, in terms of especially pastors in churches, but priests also. I would say that the underlying notion around privilege is the notion of power. And what comes up in power situations is relationship or the lack thereof. And so my starting place in responding to both those questions of white privilege alone, or the white and then male, which is another level of privilege, if you will, in this culture and in our church, whom we love. And of course, the position of privilege of priest in a parish. The starting place is, what kind of relationships do you want to be forming? And regardless of what the structure says, you still have the ability to form relationships. And when I look at that question for myself, as I look at my own white privilege and how much more I have to look at it personally, to say nothing of, societally and within religious congregations. I think it's no secret that Catholic sisters, Catholic religious women religious in the United States have been trying to look at our white privilege for years now. I'm going to say we don't know, because if we knew, we'd be doing something about it. And I think our brother Brian Massengel's reflection on that in his recent article is quite powerful and quite true. We cannot say that I can't say that we know, that I know that I benefit from white privilege, because if I knew it, I would be doing something about it. And so I might say I know, but I really don't. I think the same holds true in terms of male and in terms of privilege around ordination in particular. So you start with the relationships. And Pope Francis wrote in Joy of the Gospel a little trinity, if you will, of how Jesus behaved in relationships, whether they were relationships of, religious denominations or outcasts that he met, or whatever they might have been, relationships. And Pope Francis tells us that when Jesus was faced with a way of being in a relationship that was love or fear, he chose love every single time, knowing what the psychologists tell us now, that humans do everything they do out of those two emotions. We do everything we do out of love or out of fear. And so when I look at my own relationships and my own participation in white privilege and white supremacy, when my brothers on this call might look at their own gender specificity of being male in a church that provides different avenues for participation than it does for females who are in the church. Or when those of you on the call in ordained ministry in parishes realize that you are in a position of power, the question comes down to, what kind of relationships do I want to have? And all of us are faced with either love or fear in a relationship. The second characteristic Pope Francis names for Jesus is when he had a choice in relationships to exercise mercy or judgment, he chose mercy every single time over judgment. So in our relationships, mercy over judgment, at every single time, no exception. And the third characteristic Francis lays out is that when Jesus had an opportunity in a relationship and he was faced with either inclusion or exclusion of someone, he chose inclusion every single time over exclusion. And so love over fear, mercy over judgment, inclusion over exclusion. So imagine what my relationships would look like if I chose love over fear every single time. If I chose mercy over judgment and inclusion over exclusion. I think what it would make me realize is that I live in a very small world. The statistics tell us that 7 out of 10 people on the planet can't read. 7 out of 10 cannot read. 6 of those 7 are women. I'm here to tell you that every woman in my life not only can read, but has more degrees than sometimes even seem possible to have. So just on that one criterion, I really need to stop and have a pretty big conversation with myself. So how inclusive am I in my relationships? So the short answer, I think, is for both the white privilege and the male white, ordained privilege. I think it is, what kind of relationships do we want? And I would just offer, what kind of a church might we have if it was kind of built on the principles of choosing love over fear, mercy over judgment, and inclusion over exclusion? Now, I know that throws open a whole conversation about current practices and, mores and things like that. Evolutionary times need that say that all of that needs to be looked at again. You don't throw it out. I'm not throwing anything out. You upend all of it and you reclaim what is appropriate for this time.
I think this is an expansion of that conversation. The question, or the request, is to please expand on fear gripping our country.
Sister, I'm sorry to interrupt right here just for a second. If you have questions for Sister, you need to send them in the chat box to the screen name Ask Questions. The Tech Ops guys are trying to help, but you need to send them in it to Ask Questions. That's the best way to get your question to Sister. Okay, sorry about that. Just wanted to chime in.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, fear gripping the country. I think there's 2 pieces floating in my mind and heart right now. I am absolutely afraid of this virus. And I'm afraid because it is new. We don't have data on it. It seems to be, I talked to some friends of mine who are biologists, and it seems to be mutating even from human to human, because it's showing up with different symptoms in different places and in different ages and so forth. So, I would say that I am fearful. I mean, it's not like paranoid, but I am very cautious, and so forth. So I think there's a fear gripping the country, if you will, gripping the planet in terms of COVID-19. I am not afraid, at least I don't think I am. I'm not afraid of looking at my own racism. I think the fear that's gripping the country is a fear of recognizing. It's kind of what I said earlier about resisting denial and embracing the reality. It is very painful for somebody like me to hear that what I was taught in school by people whom I loved and trusted only taught me at best a piece of the whole story, and taught me that piece of the story from a particular perspective. It's the same kind of undoing that happened when I studied theology and realized in scripture that the voices of women were just written out of the story by the people who wrote the story. It was very unsettling for me, having been raised Catholic and educated Catholic and all that. And so I think that's a fear that undoes your consciousness. I would say that at some unarticulated level, that some of the people in our country right now who are so afraid, the way it's coming out is anger, more competition, rhetoric that incites. So when that kind of thing happens, you have to step back and say, not really sure that's fear. It might be parading as fear, but what's underneath of it is some intuitive, even if it can't be spoken about by everybody, it's some intuitive sense that life as I knew it is over, and recreating a social structure is going to mean something for me too. And I might not really like it because it won't be my way. So that's a huge question. I would encourage all of us to keep holding on to that. What is it that is really gripping our country right now? Is it fear? Or is it a sense of life in this country is changing, and quote, keeping them out is really not a viable option? Secondly, keeping them, quote, in their place is no longer sustainable. And thirdly, around the economic piece, we can no longer maintain an economy that works only for some. When you have those three things put in front of you every day, like we have for the past several months now, it pulls the proverbial rug out from under people's feet. And if they have no other place in their consciousness or in their spirit to go that anchors them, they're just going to come out pretty volatile. I'm not sure it's fear that's gripping the country. I think it's more a fear of things that have been the way they are in this country are no longer sustainable.
Here is a question that I'm sure will take hardly no time at all to answer as soon as we get it back on the screen. Many observe a large gap between younger clergy in the church and those who remember Vatican II and what was before. Some of the younger don't like the deinstitutionalization that is happening. What can we do to help the gap close more?
In times of uncertainty, what the human psyche wants is certainty. And I think this bent towards fundamentalism, because fundamentalism is across all sectors, as you know, it's in politics, it's in economics, it's in religion, it's in social stratification. I mean, it's everywhere. Fundamentalism is driven by fear of change, because the fundamentalists are correct, you know, when they say things can't change. For example, this goes way back, but language that's used in our particular church, in our faith family. The fundamentalists who say you cannot begin talking about God in any other way except masculine. There is some truth in that, because when you begin talking, because language gives rise to thoughts, when you begin using different language, like Black Lives Matter, which is not the same as all lives matter. When you begin using language for God that is relational, besides gender specific, male and female, but relational, you can't stop there. Because once you begin relating to God relationally and across gender, you're going to have a conversation, at least with yourself, about scripture, about sacrament, about worship, about morality. You cannot just change the language about God, because it will in fact change all the other conversations you're having. The other piece, the other way that shows up is the conversation that seems very difficult to have in our faith community around sexuality. It simply means one thing, male, female, and you know, and so forth. Suspend that articulation of that theology precedes all the science. And so it's not possible to have a conversation, a meaningful conversation about women, for instance, in the church, without having a conversation about how does the church understand the gift of sexuality. And so the response to those kinds of questions and those kinds of evolutionary inquiries is to shut it down because we don't know the answer. And so we're only going to entertain the questions that we already have the answers for. And in a time of uncertainty, there's a great attraction to having the answers. And so when you say about closing the gap, I'm not sure about closing the gap, to be quite honest with you. Again, it kind of goes to fix or reform. You do not fix or reform in an evolutionary moment. You embrace the unfolding of the evolutionary moment. And so I'm not sure about fixing the gap between, Vatican II vision of a church and some of our younger ordained brothers who are being attracted to and coming through seminary. I think we have to live with that gap. I think the worst thing to do would be to fix it, to try to fix it. I think we have to live with the gap.
Here's a question from a subgroup, the breakout group. Our group had several participants with experience in community organizing and development. How can our contemplation help lead others from previous institutions to new church models?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the community organizers among us really need to step up at this moment in time. If there was ever a time for prototyping, we need it. Community organizers, in their DNA is to assess a situation post-earthquake, post-tsunami, post-whatever it might be. Get in there, assess a situation, see what's needed, identify all the leadership within the group that can actually make those things happen and set it up for a 6-month time frame. And it's intended to fail. We need that kind of rapid prototyping, because what community organizing knows at best is you have got to use the leadership that is on the ground. You cannot come in with a cookie cutter or a template. You have got to use the people that are there, the resources that are there, help to get resources that are needed perhaps, but it all needs to be at the grassroots level. So I would say in our contemplative stance, that mode of behavior from community organizing does not exist in the institutional church. It doesn't exist in the country, except in catastrophes and disasters. So my hope would be that there'd be more community organizing. And, there's a question asked earlier in a group that I was in about, the impact of COVID. And I referred to this a little bit in my first reflection this afternoon. The circles that I'm in, lots and lots and lots of people are finding very meaningful ways to be in community, to share faith, to worship. It's going to be very interesting, I think, to see what happens when the churches and parishes across the country, quote unquote, open up, even when it's safe, after COVID-19 and vaccine and so forth. I'm not really sure, and I'm not sure because life in the church across the country was spotty at best before COVID-19. There were parishes thriving, and there were other parishes that were just not meeting people's spiritual needs, was not resonating with their real life. So I'm not really sure how everything's going to come back to the way it was before COVID-19. That's the place where a contemplative stance says the message of the gospel is too important and too healing for people. We've got to get in there where the people are and start doing some rapid prototyping. Start creating faith communities. Maybe they're not parishes structurally, but start creating faith communities where people find meaning and where people have deep relationships with each other and where people help each other live out their gospel baptismal call, and where people actually serve one another and build a community that is more gospel-like. So short answer is I hope that our contemplative stance leads more of us to develop those community organizing skills. And I hope the community organizers help more of us to deepen our contemplative stance. Most community organizers I know are the deepest contemplatives I've ever met, because they listen to the people.
A question that may be similar, in some ways at least, with the great common goal of living the gospel. How do we tie together with dignity the followers of Jesus, regarding the mindset of the National Catholic Reporter to the National Catholic Register attitudes? How do we find common ground to walk together? Hello? I'm not hearing you.
Yeah, I know. I was muted. The host gave me permission to speak again. So it's a wonderful function and power that he has to give us permission to speak. Thank you very much. Yeah, let me, I'm looking at the time, so this will be our last question for now. Again, another really wonderful, wonderful question. I would say that, you know, probably at the heart of that question is a very deep dive into our own kind of examination of conscience, if you will. And if we're not willing to do that, then I'm not sure the question is even going to be able to be embraced, you know. So I think I'm going to speak a little bit about this, but let me just say something before we end. The kind of polarization that exists in the country and in the church right now, in terms of the two NCRs, you know, National Catholic Reporter, National Catholic Register, it is a symptom. It's a symptom. And again, I would say we cannot heal the divide. That will be like putting Band-Aid on a broken leg. The conversation we need to have is not about how do we fix this gap or fill it in. It's about why is there such a gap? And I'd like to speak a little bit to that later on this afternoon. So I think I'm going to stop for there, and I think we're going to be ready for our break pretty soon. Thank you very much for those questions. They were wonderful.